Alright, welcome back to Mr. Burley Teaches. We're going to get into part 2 of biodiversity. Now that we know a bit about ecosystems and how they work and how they function, their components, we can now start looking into species diversity and how wildlife populations interact with their ecosystems. What makes a species? This should be a review. There's basically three things that makes a species. They're morphologically different. They have different phenotypes and different genotypes, so they contain different traits and habits. Alright, they are also different at the DNA level. Alright, since the technology became available to look at DNA sequencing, the amount of species actually increased because we can now take two species that look the same and act the same, but at the DNA level they're very different, which makes them different species. And the last thing is that they reproduce in isolation. So those three things basically make a species. Just got a picture here of a lot of ants, a lot of different ant species, and thinking about that how morphologically different they are from each other. They have different traits and habits. They reproduce separately, and at the DNA level they are different species. And I throw this slide in just to kind of give you some food for thought. As of right now in human history, there is one species of humans, Homo sapiens. Over the course of history, there were times when there were multiple species of humans that called Earth home. And you're talking about Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, all these different types of humans on the planet. And for whatever reason, they phased out. They were killed off. Maybe they went extinct in the Lake Toba supervolcanic eruption. For whatever reason, the Homo sapien is the one species of human that survived, and here we are today. All right, so I like this, just kind of food for thought. What if multiple species of humans remained on the planet, and they're very different species, they're morphologically different, different traits and habits, their brain structures are different, so they think in different ways. So what if there were various species of humans on the planet? What would our world look like? Of course, that is not the case, so it's just a mental exercise, but it's entertaining thought nonetheless. Okay, so how many species are out there? There are about 1.4 million known species on the planet. Alright, now that is not all of them. We don't know everything. We're finding species every day. We've kind of narrowed it down. A good estimate, you can think to yourself, is anywhere between 5 and 50 million species on planet Earth. Alright, so we're not sure exactly, but somewhere in between 5 and 50 million is probably a good estimate of species on Earth. And again, we know of 1.4 million. So out of the total 1.4 million species, let's take a look at where the most species are. And it might be not where you think. Okay, here you go at insects. 750,000 species of insects. And if you include mites and ticks and spiders in there, you got another 120,000 species of insects, mites and ticks and spiders. So more than half of the species on the planet are insects. Alright, we are dominated by insects. And then if you throw plants in there, you're talking almost 75% of the species on Earth are plants and insects. So that should give you a little viewpoint on our planet. We obviously dominate in influence and size. Alright, here's mammals. But we definitely do not dominate in numbers. There's only about 4,000 mammals on the planet. Alright, if you compare the number of mammals with something like sponges, you see, well, there's actually more sponges on Earth than mammals. Alright, so just something to kind of think about. And one last thing I'll point out is a lot of people think how many bacteria species there must be, and there's not too many, alright? Only about 5,000 bacterial species on the planet. You can think about how important those species are. We would not be living if there wasn't bacteria in the soils and in our guts and the places that benefit our lives. But there's only about 5,000 known species of bacteria. Maybe as better technology comes about, that number will increase, but consider that our planet is dominated by insects and plants. Alright, so here are some sponges. Just think they're cool. Very colorful, interesting species. All right, mammals are only a small fraction. We've noticed that most species seem to be concentrated in certain places on Earth, and we call these places biodiversity hotspots. These are the places where biodiversity is greatest. They are designated by an organization called Conservation International. Right, that's the group that designates these biological hotspots, these biodiversity hotspots. And they designate these places as being the most important places to protect on Earth because of their diversity in species. And if you notice, most are found in tropical regions, Hawaii, Central American rainforests in Indonesia, islands. Here's Madagascar. So these are the places that we should really help to protect because of the sheer amount of diversity in those habitats. Alright, these biodiversity hotspots are so important, not only because of the amount of biodiversity, but also because they are home, their habitats are home for species that are found nowhere else on planet Earth. We call those endemic species. Alright, these are species that live in small areas and nowhere else on Earth. So for example, Hawaii is a perfect example. Alright, we'll go example the Hawaiian Islands. There's species that live on the Hawaiian Islands that live nowhere else in the world. And if their populations decrease or even go extinct, they will go extinct from the planet. Alright, so endemic species are extremely important to protect, to understand where they are, their habitats, and to protect. And from the 34 designated hotspots by Conservation International, it encompasses about 2.3% of all the landmass on Earth, but it houses about 50% of the Earth's plant species and about 42% of all invertebrates. In just a small amount of landmass on Earth, these designated biodiversity hotspots, it contains 50% of the plant species and 42% of all the invertebrates. So, very important places to protect and monitor and be aware of. Okay, so let's move on and talk about another concept that is called species fitness. Alright, and the fitness of a species, this is an idea that was put forth by Charles Darwin. Alright, this is the ability of a species to do two things. First thing is to reproduce, and the second thing is to survive. I don't mean survival by the fittest, but its actual ability to survive. So when we refer to species fitness, we're talking about a species' ability to reproduce and to survive. And Darwin had a couple of observations. I think we all know that Darwin did his work in the Galapagos, a very diverse ecosystem. And when he was in the Galapagos, he came up with a couple of observations. The first one was that species produce an excessive amount of offspring, and he wondered why. Why do these species produce so many offspring? So the second thing he observed was not all of them survive. So which ones were the ones to survive? The species have an excessive amount of offspring because they know that not all are going to survive, and they want to increase their chances of their species surviving. The third thing he noticed was that the ones that survived had certain traits that were passed down by the parents to the offspring, and they were the determining factor whether that species would survive. So it was the traits that were passed down that was the determining factor. All right, those species that had the right traits were the ones that were left to reproduce. What he came up with was that you must have the right traits. That's the most important thing. Alright, and we give those traits a name. We call them adaptations. And these are what would help a species reproduce and survive. The adaptations. Okay, so there's purposes of these adaptations. There's 4 purposes. The first purpose of adaptations is to reproduce. Alright, that should make sense. The second one is to survive. Species need the right traits, right adaptations to avoid predators, to survive. Those adaptations might mean, or might be camo, right, camouflage. It might be mimicry. It might be things like speed, agility, the ability to fly, things like that. All right, anything to avoid predators. The third purpose of adaptation is to obtain energy. All species need to obtain energy. All right, so in the case of an animal, it might be the ability to eat. In the case of a plant, we might be talking about an adaptation where the plant finds sunlight. All right, the adaptation of a vine where it crawls up another plant and grows very quickly to look for light. The fourth purpose of adaptation here is the ability to adapt to climate and other limiting factors. All right, so that might be a fur, all right, or the ability to be cold-blooded. All right, these are adaptations by plants or animals to adapt to climate. Maybe the ability to dig, all right, so to get out of the hot or the cold atmosphere. Okay, so these purposes of adaptations give us a good perspective on how wildlife has adapted, and there's all kinds of different adaptations by plants and animals. All organisms, to increase their fitness, have to adapt. Okay, and this is just a good perspective. All right, so here you go, the Galapagos Island, and it's off the coast of South America. They have it boxed here to show you where we're talking about in the world, right there. All right, and the Galapagos itself houses many endemic species, those species that are found there and nowhere else in the world. When Darwin was doing his work in the Galapagos, it's interesting that he wasn't the only one working on this concept. There was another man named Alfred Wallace. They both actually independently came up with the theory of evolution and the idea that adaptations and changing species are the process for natural selection. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, Darwin goes down in history as discovering, if you will, natural selection and the theory of evolution, but Alfred Wallace was also independently working on this at the same time. Alright, so here's a couple of examples of adaptations. I just thought it was interesting to throw in some examples here. Take the elephant. You have the ears. Here's the example about the ears are huge. Okay, this animal has adapted to have huge ears because there's a lot of veins in the ears, and the elephant, which lives in a very hot climate. All right, when the animal becomes hot, the blood will rush to the ears, and it can use that large surface area to fan and cool the blood, so that it maintains, appropriate body temperature, and that's an adaptation to the climate. They also walk on their tiptoes. The sheer weight to hold the animal up. Their foot pads and toenails are made of the same material as fingernails, so it's like a soft cushion, so it helps support the weight. All right, that's a physical adaptation. The trunk is obvious adaptation to be able to obtain food. And here's a quick fun fact: it can pick up a blade of grass with its trunk. All right, and then the male's survival adaptation is the tusk. All right. It uses them to fight and also as a tool, but that's a survival adaptation. So there's an example of the elephant and its adaptations. Another quick example would be the owl. I thought these were really cool, not only because I love owls and it's one of my favorite animals, but it's an interesting creature. Their necks have tremendous amounts of flexibility so that they could follow prey. They can almost turn their neck 360 degrees around, and it's all about finding prey, so that's a survival adaptation. And same thing with sharp talons to grab things on the move, and they have silent flight for from feathers that muffle the sound. Right? There's special feathers in their wings that actually muffle the sound of air passing through so that they can dive from a tree to get a mouse and be silent when they do that. So these are all survival adaptations from the owl perspective. Alright, and then here's an example of a plant adaptation. So the creosote bush contains toxic chemicals. Again, another survival adaptation so that animals will not eat it. There's toxic chemicals in the leaves. And also on the leaves are resins so that it maintains moisture and holds water so that water isn't lost by evaporation. And then to make sure that it reproduces, it produces a bright flower that attracts pollinating insects. Again, the purpose of adaptations are to reproduce, survive, obtain energy, and to adapt to climate.